in the world you are. First of all, as I welcome you, I'd just like to say that I hope you and your loved ones are all doing well in what is, I think we all acknowledge, an extraordinary time. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to what is the very first webinar lecture that we've had as both the East Asia National Resource Center and the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. As Richard mentioned, I'm the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies and the co-director of the East Asia National Resource Center. These are the two premier Asian Studies centers at the George Washington University, and are really not only the center of the intellectual and research life for Asian studies at the university, but a leading center in Washington, D.C. Before I turn it over to Deepa Alapalli, who will be moderating this evening's, or this morning's, as it were, panel, I'd just like to say how excited I am to hear from our expertise this evening. I'm sure we've all watched with a combination of fascination and horror as we've seen both a complete lack of leadership by some international actors and a real leadership role taken by other international actors, some of whom we're going to talk about this evening. And it's been very interesting for me, and I'm sure for many of you, to watch, especially with the World Health Assembly coming up, the reactions internationally about how Taiwan, which is seemingly handling this so well and really an exemplar in terms of a public health reaction, just watching how this is being handled. So I hope you enjoy our discussion over the next hour and a half. I'd encourage you to ask many questions in the Q&A box. As Richard already mentioned, we have an enthusiastic and highly knowledgeable panel of experts who will be happy to engage with that. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Deepa.
Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon, good morning. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here from different places, and we have a full of people today signing up, nearly 140 so far. So I'm expecting a really invigorating set of questions coming up. It's indeed, as Ben said, I'm the associate director of the Sigur Center and also a research professor of international affairs here. And I will be moderating the session. And one of the things that I think we are all looking forward to is hearing from our panelists, who, including one person who's actually in Taiwan, and on this topic of COVID-19 and Taiwan's international space reimagined. I think we're reimagining a lot of things, and so why not reimagine Taiwan's international space in this new world that we're all facing together? And as Ben said, I hope all of you are staying well. Well, here we are in the midst of this global and devastating global pandemic, and just 4 days away from the World Health Assembly annual meeting, we still don't know if Taiwan is going to get an invitation. It still has not gotten one. And clearly, this is quite shocking in some sense, because Taiwan has been one of the early success stories in handling this. And there are many who have not handled it well. And so obviously, this has very little to do with global health and everything to do with global politics. And we've been seeing this controversy. I'm sure you're all following with great interest the controversy that's being played out and in various places at the highest levels, including at the World Health Organization itself, in Taiwan, in China, and other places. And I have to say that this controversy, this pandemic, has rocketed Taiwan's situation in the international community in places and brought it to attention of people that never really thought about Taiwan. So this is, in some sense, it could be a turning point. But will it be, and what are the prospects going forward? So to help us think through some of these really critical questions at the moment, we have 3 panelists, and as well as a discussant. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a short introduction. They all have extremely distinguished resumes. I'm just going to give a highlight, one or two highlights for each of them. And then I will turn it over to them. Short presentations, 10 minutes each. I will actually enforce it quite forcefully, I'm afraid, just because we have never done this webinar type of event before, and we don't want to have any glitches. So we're going to have to keep everything as tight as possible. So with that, let me turn and introduce our esteemed group of panelists. So we will start with Professor Jacques deLisle. He is at the University of Pennsylvania. He's director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. He's a prolific author and written numerous books, including most recently China's Global Engagement. Another two books that will be of particular interest to this group is his recent book, Political Changes in Taiwan Under Ma, and then some early advertisement for his forthcoming book here, which is entitled Taiwan Under Tsai. So he's really keeping up to date with the developments in Taiwan. And he will be speaking to us about WHO and the new pandemic politics at play. Following him, we will have James Lin, who is an assistant professor at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Professor Lin is a historian, and he focuses on Taiwan and Taiwan's interactions with the world in the 20th century. He is very involved with and a leading member of their new Taiwan Studies program. So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from the University of Washington. And we will give the third panelist will be Dr. Ai-Chung Lai, who's coming from, joining us all the way from Taiwan. He is the president of the Prospect Foundation, a very well-known independent research organization dedicated to the study of foreign policy and international affairs. He has been, among other things, vice president of another important institution called Taiwan Think Tank. Dr. Lai has also held several senior positions in DPP, in the Democratic Progressive Party's foreign affairs portfolios. And special thanks to Dr. Lai for getting up so early and joining us. Thank you, Dr. Lai. He will be speaking to us about Taiwan's health diplomacy and its new international soft power. So now I want to start with Professor deLisle, who is going to talk about the pandemic politics at play at WHO. And I want to ask him, Jacques, tell us, what is the controversy that's going on all about? And give us an up-to-date of what Taiwan is facing at the moment. And 10 minutes, please. Jacques?
Yeah, there we go. So I was just getting unmuted. Thank you very much, Deepa, for the kind. It's great to be back at GW, if only virtually. So as Deepa said, the World Health Assembly is having its annual plenary session beginning on Monday. It will be doing it online, as everyone does everything these days. But Taiwan's participation is very much on the agenda. Taiwan was able to attend the WHA as an observer for 8 years, starting in 2009, and that invitation got yanked at the beginning of the Tsai administration for obvious reasons. But with the impact of the novel coronavirus, we've seen a real enhancement of the kind of arguments and support for restoring Taiwan's access. And this matters not just because of the obvious public health issues, but as Deepa said, it's a lot about politics. It's about Taiwan's access, its international space, and things of that ilk. So the COVID-19 silver lining, if there is one, is that it's made the case more compelling for Taiwan's access. On the other hand, Beijing's opposition and other factors are creating challenges that are even more daunting than those that faced Taiwan when it first sought successfully to get access to the WHA meetings nearly a decade ago. And so I'm going to tell a story with some pictures, no words on my PowerPoint slides, and 4 cliches. So if I can have the next slide, I'll do the first cliche. And the first cliche is that this should be a case of an irresistible force, the compelling argument for Taiwan's access for public health reasons and other reasons to the WHA, an irresistible meeting what may turn out to be an immovable object of China's opposition. And that's more or less where we are. Next slide, please. And second cliche, which is that this in a way feels like Back to the Future. The coronavirus saga resembles a lot the saga of SARS a decade and a half ago, and that is a big part of what got Taiwan access to the WHA meetings, which was really Taiwan's first entree into the UN-centered system, since the ROC was dismissed from the UN and the Chinese seat was handed to Beijing back in the early 1970s. And the similarities between the two crises are really quite striking. You have a severe respiratory ailment, highly communicable, breaking out on the Chinese mainland. You have Chinese government authorities at various levels keeping it quiet. You have doctors, the 2 doctors are pictured here, Jiang Yangyong and Li Wenliang, who discovered what was going on, tried to get the word out, and the word was quashed. There was underreporting from China. There was a certain slowness to react, and ultimately a failure to keep the disease from spreading in a way that brought China in for a lot of criticism from the world for not having done more to stop the pandemic, the epidemic, from getting out. So after SARS, Taiwan eventually did gain, again, access to the WHA for 8 years. And what drove that was this sense that China had bungled the response to SARS in a way that put Taiwan and the rest of the world at risk, and that it had been rather tone deaf in bullying severely affected Taiwan. And unlike with COVID-19, Taiwan was hit very hard by SARS. It was one of the most severely hit places on a per capita basis. So in its WHO quest, Taiwan has benefited not only from the SARS phenomenon, in the sense that China's, but next slide, please, but also because this is a case where Taiwan, in seeking access to WHA, is doing something that rather resembles areas in which Taiwan has been fairly successful in gaining more international status and stature over the years. And I think if you look at the areas where Taiwan has been relatively successful, they have a few features in common often. First, in this case, Taiwan can argue quite plausibly that its exclusion from more full-fledged engagement with the WHO, whether it be WHA meetings or technical meetings, or sharing medical information, that its exclusion is really dangerous for Taiwan. We saw it with SARS, and it could well have happened with COVID-19, and you all know the story of the email where Taiwan warns the WHO of human-to-human transmission, and the WHO disputes that. So that feature is common here, prominent here. Secondly, Taiwan can argue quite plausibly, and its supporters can argue quite plausibly, that if the international public health regime centered on the WHO doesn't let Taiwan have full access, then the regime is not going to function very well. That's, again, we're not going to get the information shared, and that's again, the saga of the email. So it's an incomplete regime in a way that is dangerous, not just to Taiwan, but to the world as a whole. And third, the WHO-WHA structure is kind of like the WTO, kind of like the International Civil Aviation Organization, in that it doesn't involve high politics. It's a functional, social, economic, public health kind of thing. It doesn't touch on sovereignty the way, say, access to the assembly or even the law of the sea regime might. So what you've got are salient features of the SARS crisis, which paved the way for Taiwan's access to the WHO, are being reprised now in the COVID-19 pandemic, but they should be even more compelling because of the wider reach, the greater death toll, and the more severe economic havoc that this is reaching. Next slide, please. Further in Taiwan's favor is my third cliche: nothing succeeds like success. Quite strong because it has been, unlike with SARS, and partly because of SARS, Taiwan has been amazingly successful at handling the coronavirus outbreak. After SARS, Taiwan strengthened its public health and emergency response system. It put in place a National Health Command Center and a Central Epidemic Command Center, which were deployed very quickly. Testing got out quickly, containment. There was a quick ramping up of supplies for personal protective equipment, support for people put into quarantine. It really was a model response. And in the end, Taiwan is now reporting 0 local transmissions. and has under 10, I think it was 7 at last count, confirmed COVID-19 deaths and fewer than 400 cases. And this success story should matter. Taiwan is in a position, because of its success, to punch far above its weight and in turn to bolster its international stature. And it's tried to do so. It's been showcasing its accomplishments, telling how successful it's been. Share its expertise and lessons from its experience with others, and it has reprised a role we've seen in disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, and other areas where Taiwan is providing assistance to other countries, including sending masks to places that are short on equipment, including the United States. And basically, this has put Taiwan in a quite strong position, it would seem, to press its WHA bid at this time. Next slide, please. On the other hand, what a difference a dozen years makes. Those aren't the same faces you would have seen 12 years ago if we were having the story, and those faces, or at least what they represent, have made the odds for Taiwan's bid a lot longer. Of course, it wasn't just SARS, it was also the fact that Ma Ying-jeou was the president of Taiwan at the time that Taiwan finally gained access several years after the SARS crisis, because he was a leader acceptable to Beijing in a way that Tsai Ing-wen certainly is not, especially after having run a successful re-election campaign talking about how Beijing's plan is to make Taiwan look a bit like Hong Kong, not exactly an appealing example to Taiwanese these days. A second change is Xi Jinping, although it's not exclusively him, but compared to a decade and a half ago, China has much more capacity and much more determination to resist foreign demands and criticism. So even though there's a strong coalition of states, the US, Japan, others, backing Taiwan's greater access, China seems less amenable to that kind of pressure than it used to be. The WHO under Tedros, who was not a Chinese national, unlike many UN agency heads these days, but was China's favored candidate, as well as many other countries' favorite candidates. He presides over a WHO at which China has a lot of clout, and where there is a certain wariness of offending China, and we saw that in the effusive praise of China's initial response. And then, of course, we had a very ugly dust-up between Tedros and Taiwan when people in social media were saying really quite nasty things about the Director General, and he interpreted it as racist and wanted the government to do more to shut it down. And it was a lot of bad there. On the other hand, there are some positive factors in the change here. One is that there is greater wariness. Next slide, please. There is greater wariness toward China than there was a while ago. There was 15 years ago. US-China relations more sour. A lot of the countries in the region, a lot of the people back in Taiwan's bid here are much more wary of China and its throwing its weight around. And China is held in even more ill odor now because of the way COVID-19 was handled. Now, these things have their roots quite a ways back. You can trace it back at least a decade ago and probably a bit more, but it's gotten a lot sharper in recent years, in the Trump years in the US, where you see things like the national security strategy that labels China a revisionist power and a strategic competitor. And you see things like the recently passed Taipei Act, which includes, among other things, specifically support for Taiwan's greater access to the WHO and similar organizations. The Trumpian turn in US policy, however, does have its dark side. It has created an impression that because the administration is now so strongly anti-China and strongly anti-WHO and is pushing a narrative to deflect blame for its own inadequacies onto China, that any pro-Taiwan argument runs the risk of being undercut by this sense that it's being used instrumentally. And the backdrop of Trump's general denunciation and Pompeo's denunciation of the WHO is really not helping the case for the US trying to influence the WHA and WHO in Taiwan's favor. Last thing I'll say, my fourth and final cliche, is don't let a good crisis go to waste. And so Taiwan has a good crisis to work with here. A crisis no one wanted has created an opportunity for Taiwan to make gains in terms of protecting and expanding its international space. But to do so with maximum success, Taiwan needs to be careful in a couple of ways. It needs to avoid miscues. It needs not to feed the suspicions that are out there that it is disingenuously invoking public health concerns in the service of what's primarily a symbolic agenda. Next slide, please. Okay. The last one, I think, yes. It needs to keep it focused on the public health issues and not make it sound like it's purely a status bid. That's always a fine line to walk. And I would also caution Taiwan to be a little bit wary of just how stable and secure the US support is. We have a rather volatile administration on just about every issue these days. And I don't think it's focused entirely on Taiwan's interests in this area. And of course, it's possible there will be a new administration come January. With that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Your cliches were all extremely edifying. And thank you also for staying right on time. And moving along, and by the way, at the end of the three presentations, we will have a very short discussant who will jump in, my colleague Bob Sutter, and I'll introduce him at that point. But for the time being, let me now turn to our next speaker, Dr. Lin. And Dr. Lin will speak about the Taiwan's international space in historical perspective. In other words, Jacques told us about where we are right now in terms of what Taiwan faces. And James, you're going to tell us how did Taiwan get to this spot?
All right, thanks for having me, Deepa. So first we want to start with, go ahead and go to the next slide. We want to start with first a question about what is Taiwan's international status before we jump into the history here. Next. So we know that Taiwan is represented with a number of names internationally. In the Olympics, it competes as Chinese Taipei. And names like Chinese Taipei kind of obscure its national status. It's meant to infer a bit of ambiguity so as to keep certain parties happy about Taiwan's status. Now, next, in the International Standards Organization, which is the database that's used by a number of corporations and other kinds of organizations, Taiwan is represented as Taiwan, province of China. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is the case. Next. Next again. Okay. In the United Nations, if you go under T, you'll see that Taiwan is not here, and it's not here under the Republic of China, which is another name. And the question here is then, why is that the case? So next. Basically, what Taiwan's status is that of exclusion and marginalization. Next. And the question then becomes, how did this came to be? And what are the consequences of this historical exclusion? What does it mean for Taiwan's current status today in discussions like what Jacques just mentioned with WHO and WHA? Next. So I want to go back a little bit to 1971, and this is kind of where many people point to as the turning point in Taiwan's marginalization, Taiwan's exclusion internationally. In 1971, October 25th, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 2758. Now, if you remember, 1971 was a very different time. This was when Taiwan was a member of the UN as the Republic of China. And back then, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, was not a member. And this is because of an ongoing kind of civil war that was drawn out. This is the middle of the Cold War. There were lots of things going on in terms of geopolitics. Resolution 2758 was designed to address that situation. Why don't we highlight this last paragraph here? So this is the last paragraph that tells us the action that 2758 took. And I'll read it really quickly. Decides to restore all of its rights to the People's Republic of China and to recognize the representatives of its government as the only legitimate representatives of China to the United Nations, and to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy at the United Nations and in all organizations related to it. So here you have the kind of sentence that leads to today's circumstances where certain actors can point to 2758 and say, in fact, Taiwan is not supposed to be in the UN. But if you read this entirety, kind of all four paragraphs, you'll see that Taiwan is actually never mentioned here. And this is because, as I mentioned earlier, this is primarily designed to address an issue regarding the legitimate representation of China. And this is an issue that was very historically contextualized and is quite different from what's going on today. So let's go next. So you see mentioned representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. They don't actually use the term Republic of China here, but that's what they're referring to. Chiang Kai-shek, of course, was the dictator that ruled the Republic of China from roughly 1927 until his death in the 1970s. He ruled Taiwan from 1949 until the 1970s as essentially a dictatorship, an authoritarian government that was repressive, that enacted multiple human rights abuses. Let's go next. So in 1949, basically, the Republic of China government is moved to the island of Taiwan. And this is a consequence of the Communist Revolution, the Civil War, where Chiang Kai-shek thought that by basing himself in Taiwan, he could protect himself from the ongoing war and kind of use it as a base to recoup. Next. So here in this propaganda poster, you kind of see what essentially in one picture the Republic of China goal was. It was one, to build up Taiwan, and this meant economic development, so that it could fund military coffers and in turn retake the mainland. And this has always been the goal of Chiang Kai-shek and always been the goal of the Republic of China, to retake the mainland and to kick out the illegitimate communist government. Next. So let's talk a little bit more about the Republic of China on Taiwan and what that means. Next. When you look at this timeline, this is a timeline of basically modern Taiwanese history. And if you look 400 years ago and you go all the way until today, you'll see a series of colonizations where Taiwan was essentially controlled as part of larger colonial empires. Next. So notice that this last one, the nationalist regime, is actually quite recent, 1945. And we have to keep in mind about this recency and also to put it into the context of a much longer colonial history and to treat the nationalist regime, which came in as an outsider regime and in fact was not accepted by most Taiwanese, as a colonial one. Next. So even in the eyes of the Republic of China, we have to understand that Taiwan was always seen as Taiwan province. And if you go around to some places in Taiwan, up until recently, even kind of everyday objects that remind us of this colonial relationship, for example, a license plate that says Taiwan Shen, and that refers to the fact that Taiwan province is one province within this larger imagined kind of geography of China as a whole. And that kind of political imagination was the ruling legitimacy of the ROC up until quite recently. Next. So it didn't change until about the late 1980s when Taiwan underwent democratization. In the 1980s, this is about a decade plus after the death of Chiang Kai-shek, you had an increased letting up of martial law, you had increased free elections, freedom of the press, and along with this is a period where the Taiwanese began to understand kind of their own historical past, their own identity vis-a-vis the regime that had ruled them for about 40 years, the Republic of China regime. Next. So this leads to what I would call a period of decolonization that we've seen in the past 30 years. You can see this especially in the very famous surveys done by the Election Study Center at National Zhengzhou University, where Taiwanese identity has been on the increase in the past 30 years or so. Next. So in 2019, you'll see that around 58% of Taiwanese identify themselves just as Taiwanese. And next. Only about 3.5% identify as Chinese, however you'd like to interpret that, but in the survey, 中国人. Next. So if I were to kind of sum this up, this kind of history in a very popular internet meme, other countries see Taiwan as the Republic of China, and this is what's printed on the passport that Taiwanese citizens present when they go to other countries. Next. But Taiwanese themselves, at least most Taiwanese, want to think of themselves as just Taiwan. And here you see an example of a sticker that you can buy, Republic of Taiwan, that you can put on top of your passport. Possibly illegal, but I won't comment on that. Essentially asserting a kind of Taiwanese identity that excludes the Republic of China past. Next. And the problem is that internationally you see this, this kind of sticky situation where international organizations are unwilling to or unable to address the complicated kind of status of Taiwan. And the preferred reaction then is to kind of sweep things under the rug. Next. So I'd like to conclude by kind of bringing this back to our present discussion about the WHO. And I'd like to kind of highlight 3 specific points about why this history is relevant. Next. The first is that we need to see the roots of Taiwan's marginalization, and especially if you want to point to the kind of international legal circumstances especially with UN Resolution 2758, as a kind of Cold War relic. And this was 70 years ago that, it was about 50 years ago that we had the circumstances in 1971 with the replacement of the ROC with the PRC. But that was in the midst of something that was very different than what's going on today, essentially a geopolitical battle between the PRC and the ROC in very different contexts and in very different regimes that exist today. Next. And the second is that the ROC itself is a kind of colonial anachronism. And what I mean by this is that we need to understand that the ROC's own policy of maintaining that Taiwan was always a province is something that was imposed upon the Taiwanese unwillingly, and that is something that was kind of a political reason that doesn't exist today anymore. There is no longer Chiang Kai-shek insisting that Taiwan is a part of the ROC. And in fact, most Taiwanese do not believe that themselves. Next. And so finally, I think it really points to the pressure that exists in geopolitics today as coming from something that's quite different. This idea that there are politics that Deepa mentioned early on regarding nationalism or irredentism, and that it's the ongoing pressure from the PRC today that maintains this idea of a one China policy as having any effect on Taiwan and continues to remain problematic for global health and other kinds of situations where lives are at risk. Yet kind of history is still brought to fore when in fact it is kind of out of place in many ways. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And thank you for so effectively collapsing many, many decades of complicated history into literally 10 minutes, maybe 11, but thanks again. All right. And with that, I now turn to the third and last panelist before we get to the discussant. Dr. Lai, who is in Taiwan, has been observing very closely and been involved in many of the policies. So I'm very interested, we're all very interested to hear from you as to Taiwan's health diplomacy. Is it a new soft power? What are the prospects do you see?
Thank you, Deepa, and thank you very much for having me here. I have to say that from Taiwan, it should be good morning, but probably to all of you, good evening. First of all, let me turn to the first slide, just to report the situation in Taiwan. This is just came out yesterday. Right now we have 0 new cases and accumulated cases, confirmed cases for the COVID-19, about 440. Among them, the 383 has been discharged. And unfortunately, we have 7 deaths because of that. But it is important to note that right now, Taiwan, we go 32 days without local coronavirus cases coming out. And we had 7 consecutive days with no imported infection. So right now in Taiwan, a lot of things we are able to maintain relatively normal social life. We not only we have a professional baseball that's still playing, but we are able to allow the audience. Last week, it was allowed like 1,000 people to watch the baseball game on live. And then this week, we are going to extend that. So this is sort of the situation in Taiwan right now. And next slide. The issue about the Taiwan's health diplomacy and related with COVID-19. I think what Taiwan has done so far, basically due to our relatively stable and situation in Taiwan, that not only we have enough personal protection equipment for the health workers, for the doctors, for nurses, but also for the general citizens. Right now, the supply for the surgical mask is abundant. Everyone can have access to those masks. And those masks are not just limited to the citizen in Taiwan. It also includes the foreigners. They are living in Taiwan. They are all entitled to for those personal protection equipment. And for that, we are able to donate our access capacity to other countries in need. So there are about 4 waves of the donation that we had so far. And the total number of the surgical masks we donate to the outside, about the 23.57 million, and to the location, to the country like United States, Canada, Latin America, Caribbean, many countries in the European Union, and also our diplomatic allies, country in the Middle East, and the country and partner of Taiwan's New Southbound policies there. And in addition to donating the equipment, we are also being able to help other countries in need for their dealing with the pandemic related issues, such as Palau. One episode I remember is that Taiwan has actually helped to affirm whether a cases where that is the COVID-19 or not through the remote tele working with the people there, authority there in Palau. So that I think today the Palau still registered as a 0 cases, which is also very important for their tourism and industries. Although right now a lot of foreign travel has been forbidden by other countries. And also that Taiwan right now we have been doing, of course, is through the sharing our experience in various platforms such as the tele conferences like this with other countries. I think the right now our health ministers, in addition to his daily briefing, and he also engaged quite a lot with other countries on the experience and what we have been doing to cope with the COVID-19 issues and our experience shared with other countries, and same with our digital minister and other related officials. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. I think it is important to note that in addition to our health and our health diplomacy for the COVID-19, Taiwan, we did our health diplomacy prior to the COVID-19 cases coming out. I just supplement some of the interesting information. Our former diplomatic ally, San Tome, precisely due to our assistance, I think that our involvement in the battling the marijuana cases, where the San Tome in year 2003, they have about 50% of the contact rate. But now in year 2015, that the year before that San Tome established its the diplomatic relation with Taiwan, we're able to help them to reduce to like 1.1%. So it's a reduction about 50 times. This is just one case, one episode that I just like to highlight. What we have been doing in the past prior to the COVID-19 in terms of our health diplomacy. Also, similar thing can be applied to the a country like Paraguay, where our international cooperation and development foundations, where they help to establish the so-called e-health system, similar to our universal health system in Taiwan. That system has been very instrumental in effective battling the COVID-19 diseases in Taiwan. So I just add those things as that Taiwan has been doing this prior to the COVID-19 and in COVID-19 when we're able to have access capacities. So we just continue what we've been doing to assist others as much as we can. And because of the different countries, they have the different progress in terms of how to in terms of battling the COVID-19 disease. And when Taiwan right now, we're starting to look ahead about what will be like in the post-COVID-19 world. We do draw several lessons from this. First of all, in terms of the battling the global pandemic, we believe that the global cooperation is the only effective way to deal with this the problem. And we also believe that in the post-COVID-19 world, probably the pandemic and influenza, those kind of issues will be viewed with a higher priority on a global concern, and probably that will be one of the issues for the global security. And another important lesson we believe is that the health and sanitation related requirements from now on could become the necessary elements to sustain the globalization, which basically means that globalization as we know it, that probably will be very different in the post-COVID-19 world, where we believe that the health or sanitation related requirements, that's going to be one of the key elements if we wanted to sustain the global engagement. And of course, and we believe that no area can be left out for the health coverage, as this issue will become the global security concern. So those are the four lessons we believe that when we look ahead will be like this. Now the next slide, please. The issue about the Taiwan health diplomacy and especially during the COVID-19 and how post-COVID-19, some of them actually draw from the lesson and what we did to cope with the issues. So of course, the way that the Taiwan is able to be very effective in dealing this issue is that Taiwan not only will take early actions, so that we have border examination or border control started on December 31st last year, especially on the Wuhan inbound flights. We also inactive our Central Epidemic Command Center, which is the organization that integrates and exercise the full whole government approach to allocate and mobilize all the resources, as well as the different departmental function altogether, so that we can have the whole Taiwan as one to deal with this pandemic. And another important reference for this is that Taiwan will also help employ the modern technology, especially in terms of big data analytics. That actually help us to locate some of the cases, or help us to target about the testings. Because Taiwan, we do not do the general testings, and one way of the one reason that we do not do the general testing is that we are afraid that general testing will make time to waste a lot of the valuable medical resources in testing for testing those people they are less likely to be infected. So in order to get the targeted as we wanted it, the big data analytic and the integration of the various informations, that's become a key. And through our early established university health systems, we are able to employ the kind of modern technology to get everything all together. Of course, another thing about is that the transparent communications. So those are, I would just say, those are the very important experience and Taiwan would like to share. And those are very instrumentals in the effectiveness of our battling against the COVID-19 pandemic. So that basically this means that not only the hardware donation like the personal protection equipment that we donate, but some of the software, especially know-how, we believe that can be helpful. And so that we like to share our experience with everybody and in the public platform, such as WHO. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. As we move forward, when we look beyond the current COVID-19 pandemic and to the futures, and also the four lessons we drawn earlier, we believe that first of all, the travel and the so-called trade bubble, as the one that's suggested by the New Zealand or the Australia, probably could become a new norm in the post-COVID-19 era. The reason is that when we compare the COVID-19 cases and the SARS, we do not think that there will be a very clear endpoint like what we experienced in the SARS. The transformation from the COVID-19 pandemic era to the post-COVID-19 era, probably that will be a longer period of time. And because of the different nation, they have a different recovery rate. So that for some nation, they are already coming back. They probably it will be necessary for them to establish a kind of trust circle in order for them to have a deeper engagement, just like the one in the New Zealand and Australia. And when we look examine these issues, probably from now on, the health and sanitation related requirements, just as I said earlier, could become the necessary elements if we wanted to sustain the globalization. And further down the road, probably we are going to look at the how the harmonizing or standardizing the health and sanitation for this each country's citizen or their managing of things that could be the part of the new normal in the post-COVID-19 world, which means that just like the anti-terrorism and the checkpoint for all the airport and other areas that become the new norm for the travelings. We believe that in the post-COVID-19 world, that the kind of the requirements for the personal health that probably will require a certain, whether that's a certificate or the standardizing of the health procedures among those countries. That will be very critical and necessary to establish the kind of trust circle. And if that is going to be the issues, then it's going to be very important for Taiwan to be included in those kind of discussions, especially when we're talking about standardizing the health and sanitation for each country's citizen things that's going to be part of the new normal from now on. Next slide, please.
Dr. Lai, just 1 minute, please,
Yes.
left.
Yeah, this is my last slide. So in conclusion, I think the Taiwan definitely can help, and we believe that world also needs Taiwan to help. The first of all is that we have been helping other countries before and also at the same time in the COVID-19 era, and we believe that of course COVID-19 era probably we're going to see the new regulation as well as for the sanitation and the health requirements that's going to define as a new characteristic for the globalization procedures after this. And we believe that not only we have our experience we can share, but we also need to be part of the discussion if such a new requirement is going to be implemented in the post-COVID-19 world. So whether that's going to be in the WHO or other organizations, we just hope that we could be part of it. So basically that will answer my slide, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lai. Sorry to rush you. And all I can say is that I'm very envious of all of you who are living in Taiwan. All right, and moving right along, let me just make a call to the audience just now that to please go ahead and start giving your questions in the Q&A box so that our staff can start collecting them while Bob Sutter gives his remarks. You know, this is a great opportunity for you to ask these questions. You won't get these experts together as in captivity as we have them right now. So with that, let me turn to my colleague at George Washington, Robert Sutter, who needs very little introduction. He's a professor of practice here. He's written numerous books, 22 to be exact, but who's counting? Over 300 articles, and he's an expert on East Asia. So Bob, what are your thoughts listening to our three panelists? What do you take away from this? What are your feelings now?
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure for me to be part of this distinguished panel. And I have a couple of words that just come to mind here. First, it's such a bright spot in such a gloomy atmosphere. The situation in Taiwan is a bright spot, and U.S.-Taiwan relations are in a bright spot. We've had this wonderful improvement in U.S.-Taiwan relations. Oh, goodness, it's been going on over a year or two of all sorts of new initiatives taking place. And now the U.S. government and the Taiwan government are cooperating together on this issue very well. And so I think this is it's a great opportunity, and it's a bright spot in a gloomy atmosphere. And so the point I want to make is, what do we do with the bright spot? What do we do with it? And obviously, this issue that we're talking about today is an important issue. There's all sorts of issues that need to be addressed carefully in improving the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. It's an opportunity that doesn't come along very often. We've had a few of them since normalization of relations between the United States and the PRC, but not very many. And this seems like probably the best one. And there is a history here. And the history of this part is that these previous episodes sometimes didn't work out very well. We had a big opportunity after Tiananmen, after the Cold War. And there was a big improvement in U.S.-Taiwan relations at that time, but it ended badly. And then we had an opportunity, a more quiet one, in the beginning of the George W. Bush administration. And that one ended badly too. And so what I'm encouraged and what I'm hearing from Dr. Lai and and what I'm reading about the U.S.-Taiwan government cooperation on various issues, the cooperation on this area is being done very well. It's being done in a way that's very much focused on the issues, very much focused on trying to figure out a better way for the world to deal with these issues. The idea of representation and this type of thing is downplayed to some degree, and it's handled on its merits. And I think this is a very constructive way to go about it. So I congratulate the two governments for doing this. I'm hopeful that this continued improvement in U.S.-Taiwan relations will develop fruitfully. It has been fruitful for the last year or two, and I think that this is a big opportunity for both of us to work more closely together in a way that doesn't jeopardize the interest of either side, doesn't lead to great instability or friction with Beijing. The American side will probably keep to their one China policy. I hope they do. It's a very flexible way of dealing with the issue. It avoids that provoking Beijing in a major way. And Beijing is a very powerful force, and we have to be cognizant of that. But at the same time, I think we also have to strengthen our relationships so that we can deal with Beijing now and in the future. That's what's really important. And I think that we're doing that. Our government is doing it, and I think the Taiwan government is doing it. And they seem to be doing it in a sober way. Definitely Taiwan is very sober about this as far as I can see. I worry about the Congress a little bit. They get pretty excited about things. But I think that what's important is that in the administration, they manage this effectively. So those are my remarks. I think this bright spot will continue. Again, there are very few of those bright spots in Washington these days. And I'm so glad it is. And I'm gratified to see the improvement in the relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan. And I hope there's success going forward in this area, but in all these other areas that we're working together as well. So those are my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Well, you all have been so cooperative with your time that we actually do have half an hour as we planned for the Q&A. And again, keep those questions coming. Just please identify yourself and what you're affiliated with. But we do have some questions that have come in. And so what I'm going to do to make it easy on everything, I'm just simply going to read out the questions that have been submitted and identify who the person is. All right, so the first one, not surprisingly, comes from a media person. It's from Tina Chung, reporter for the Voice of America and Chinese branch. And this is to Bob Sutter, but also others who would like to jump in. Perhaps Dr. Lai would like to join this as well in particular. But here's the question. The question is, the Trump administration has been very vocal recently on supporting Taiwan's participation at the WHO and as an observer at the WHA. They have engaged in many diplomatic moves that we haven't seen before. such as the social media campaign of Tweet for Taiwan that's been led by the US State Department. So will this kind of support help Taiwan break out of the international isolation by Beijing, or could it make relations even more tense between US, China, and China, Taiwan? So I'll start with you, Bob, and then move to the others.
Fine. This sort of just, I will build on what I just said. I think the US government is handling this thing appropriately up to this point. What's interesting is that what's unusual in the State Department doing this, if you're familiar with the history, is that the State Department used to be the agency that was in charge of keeping things restricted on Taiwan. They were the gatekeeper to make sure that other agencies didn't do too many things with Taiwan that would antagonize Beijing. Now the State Department is a cheerleader. It's the leader. They're doing these tweets and so forth. Remarkable phenomenon. But at the end of the day, it's really what they do in practical terms that will matter. And so up to this point, I haven't seen anything that would be a major infraction that would prompt Beijing's violent reaction. So, but it has to be managed carefully. So the question is asked by someone who's been through this before and says, is this going to happen again? Are we going to have a big blow up in the Taiwan Strait? And obviously, we don't want that. And I don't think this kind of what I've heard today in this panel is emblematic of a very sober, merit-based type of decision that will be made on the basis of what's been going on. And so that's very sensible, it seems to me.
Dr. Lai, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll just concur what Dr. Bob Stoddard just said. And I think it's also important to know that we should not let China to define the Taiwan-U.S. relationship. So that the issue about whether the U.S.-Taiwan closeness that will make the Taiwan Strait situation tenser, or the cross relation will be worse. I think we really need to break out this cycle. That China needs to be reminded that China can have a good relation with Taiwan and the United States, and Taiwan should be able to enjoy its relation with both China and United States. So basically, I'll say that although China probably will has its own sensitivities, but right now the United States is doing things that's about right, and the Taiwanese people are very supportive and appreciative for all the help from the United States.
All right. Anybody else want to add any comments? All right. Let me then move to the another question. This comes from Alexa Jubin, who's a professor at GW, and this is to all of the panelists. The question is, the global pandemic has shown that most countries understand Taiwan as a sovereign state that is not part of China, thanks to the global pandemic. However, even though many countries see Taiwan as a partner with shared democratic and social values, their governments continue to honor PRC's One China policy. The question is, what is stopping these countries from recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign state and establish official diplomatic relations with the island nation? Is it simply China's economic prowess? Is it China's threat of retaliation against whoever recognizes Taiwan as a sovereign state? So it's what are they afraid of? Who would like to begin the answers to this? We suspect that it's a continuation of some of what's been said, but Dr. Lai, I'm sorry to call on you again, but sitting in Taiwan, how do you view it? What's stopping most of these countries?
Of course, I think the yes, other countries they are concerned about the Chinese possible Chinese reactions, but it is China also made it as an international norm that the those countries their relation with Taiwan needs to get the approval or at least some of the tacit acquaintance from China so that they can have the relation with Taiwan. But I have to say that like 20 years ago, this was not the case, and it is only until like last 10 years China started to exercise believe they can have the veto about Taiwan external relationship, and I think it is important for the international community really look back at the what China can actually do, and sometimes you have to call them bluff. Let them know that the international system, you cannot just change the rule as you like. You have to respect other countries, their livelihood as well as their rights.
Anybody else want to?
Yeah, Deepa. Yeah, I mean, I think it is all those things. I mean, I think the PRC's squeeze on the ROC or Taiwan's international status, way back, of course, back to 1949 even, and it's been a sort of downhill slide for the ROC ever since in one form or another, with a bunch of benchmarks along the way, the UN General Assembly Resolution 71 being one of them. So it keeps on going. But we can debate all day the characteristics of Taiwan that make it a peer of many states, many fully accepted states in the international system, 23 million people, a large developed economy, self-governance, adherence to all those liberal norms of democratic governance, human rights, and so on. But that's not enough when you've got Beijing as the gatekeeper, and that's the world we live in. Basically, it's an asymmetry of investment in the issue. That is, China is far more willing and determined to treat this as a core interest and will make life in varying degrees difficult for those who cross it on this. And Taiwan has been wise enough not to push the issue. I sometimes joke with my friends in Beijing that they should thank Chen Shui-bian because he took Taiwan right up to the edge and made it clear that the kind of formal declarations were not going to be forthcoming. Basically, you have a status quo that more or less everyone can live with. I would agree with Lai Zhong in the suggestion that this has been getting worse over time. And one of the things we're seeing in the WHO context is that you're seeing China having a lot more influence in these international organizations, really becoming the gatekeeper. Now, here too, there's a WHO resolution that is contemporaneous with the 1971 General Assembly resolution, but then there's a 2005 secret memorandum, which really has the WHO recognizing China as the gatekeeper. And we see this happening all over the place as China has much more influence in it, in many cases as Chinese nationals as heads of a lot of these UN organizations. So it's just gotten tougher over time, and it more or less tracks China's increasing power and its ongoing and at times increasing determination to squeeze Taiwan's international space.
Let me ask a quick follow-on on this one to all of the panel, or at least to you and others. So what do you expect to happen at the WHO? Do you think Taiwan is going to get an invitation at the last minute?
If the world is fair, yes. The world we live in, probably not. I guess the only good news is you don't have to dispatch a delegation even to wait in the hotel lobby to see if everybody's showing up by Zoom.
Right. Okay. Well, the similar kind of question is being asked here. So let me ask it a different way. This comes from Gabriel Young, and he asked the question: if Taiwan is granted more international recognition, what is China's reaction expected to be? And conversely, what do you expect the world to do in Taiwan's defense in whichever case China responds? Who wants to take that on?
I'd like to say something about this and follow on to the increased pressure that the PRC has been putting on Taiwan. That has, I think, gotten a strong reaction by the U.S. government. In other words, they're aware of this, that Taiwan, that the PRC is trying to change the status quo in the Taiwan Straits. This, Lai pointed out and Jacques pointed out various episodes, and of course we have military displays and things like that. And this government, the U.S. government, is determined, it seems, to make sure that that doesn't stick. that yes, you change it, and the United States seems to be changing it back in various ways. And every time there's a big demonstration of military force in Taiwan, then almost like 2 days later, then you'll have a big demonstration of U.S. force in the same place. And so this kind of pressure that the PRC has put on, I think, is a very counterproductive thing. It feeds into the antagonism toward the PRC in U.S. policy toward China. That's not the only reason that we have this antagonism, but it's an element of it. And so, so Beijing, I think, has to calculate if they really push more on Taiwan, the U.S. reaction may not be to back away. It may be quite different. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing that they feel that way, that they have to worry about the United States doing something that previous administrations just wouldn't have done. And I think this is it's perhaps ironic, but it is a feature of what's happening. PRC has been increasing this pressure on Taiwan, as Dr. Lai mentioned, but the U.S. under this administration, when PRC does it, they take steps, countermeasures, and that process has been going on for a couple of years now.
If I can just add to that quickly, I agree with everything Bob said. I just want to emphasize that there are some broader and deeper roots to some of this. I mean, the degree to which the U.S. attitudes among the sort of China policy class, as it were, Congress and the people who work in administrations of either side, there's been a real turn against the belief that the relationship with China is basically positive and cooperative with some bumps in the road, to thinking it's in some significant way adversarial. So you've got China becoming more powerful and in some ways more assertive, or at least less willing to be restrained and to cast doubt on the cross-strait status quo and so on. But you've got the US, I would say going back at least 10 years, but it's been building momentum and certainly stronger under the current administration, to really be very suspicious and inclined to call China to account for these things. And I think to put the Taiwan issue in the context of it, not too many years ago, you could have said that people in both Beijing and Washington thought that Taiwan was the most likely cause, or one of the most likely causes, of an unnecessary crisis in US-China relations. And now the sense is the relationship is basically in crisis. And so any Taiwan issue is only one part of that, and that if the US were to yield on Taiwan, it wouldn't solve the basic problems in the US-China relationship. And that really creates a lot of opportunity for improved US-Taiwan relations.
Okay, thank you. Let me just take a question that's related to WHO specifically here from Kermit Harrison, retired Defense Intelligence Agency. He asked, what would prevent Taiwan from participating as an expert, that is, such as an advisor or consultant, for a member state such as the United States to the WHO in matters that they have superior knowledge of, like the pandemic? So in a sense, are there ways that Taiwan can get around the obstacle it's facing, but still have a presence in some way? I guess it's back to Jacques, perhaps, and maybe to Dr. Lai.
Go ahead.
From what I understand is that during those years, Taiwan's participation in the WHO-related functional expert meetings, we can only participate in a sort of limited number of them. And one estimate said gave us the number like 30% that we are able to be in. Even among those 30%, many of them they actually came from the last-minute invitations, and we had to rush everything in order to get there. So it is very inconvenient. But I have to say that this is basically due to the WHO Secretariat, especially in 2005, the China and WHO Secretariat, they have a secret memorandum without Taiwan's knowledge and without other countries' knowledge that for the Taiwan's participation in expert meetings, the Chinese assent, that is the necessary conditions so that in order for Taiwan to be there. And that plays all the obstacles. So basically, it is the artificial obstacle through the WHO Secretariat at that time, because they believe that have to abide by those memorandum. So the issue is that how the WHO Secretariat itself could be politically neutral in this issue and go back to the expert as was a merit-based to include Taiwan in the discussions.
If I can on that, I mean, I think this gets to something that I think Deepa mentioned at the very opening, which is the relationship between the politics of this and the public health of this. And one of the potential weak points in Taiwan's argument for inclusion is the pushback that you get from China and from the WHO that says, oh, come on, as a public health matter, we can work around this by having Taiwanese experts participate, by having channels of communication. And there were channels of communication. Taiwan was sending messages about what it knew about the outbreak in Wuhan and its spread to the WHO. So yeah, there are a lot of these channels that are there such that it's not a complete on-off switch. All that said, however, what the crises prove, what things like SARS and things like COVID, is that when you've got something this dangerous, any impediment at all, anything that has to go through Chinese clearance or has to go through a kind of back channel or has to go through the intermediary of the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, those are all playing with fire in a situation where you have a genuine public health crisis. So in that kind of context, the script kind of flips, and the argument is it is China that is playing political games here in a way that endangers public health, rather than Taiwan trying to play political games by talking about the public health consequences that could be managed without fuller participation.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, some other questions here. This is a very specific one. And I think probably Dr. Lai can answer this. Chris Lemus asks, apart from PPE, is Taiwan sending medical staff to other countries similar to what Cuba is doing? Is that something that is acceptable to a way around this restrictions, or is that something off limits?
I think we would do everything we can to help as long as those requests from other countries have been heard by us. And we have been doing this to assist our diplomatic allies in the past. Some of the cases I just mentioned in my presentations. And I think for the COVID-19s, it really depends on the specific requests from other countries, and we are also we're also conscious about different countries, especially in terms of the medical-related activities in those countries. They have certain regulations that needs to be followed. So basically, we have to abide by those restrictions. I do not know how much of those result to the limitation or unlimited about Taiwan's assistance in sending our medical staff to other countries. But we definitely would like to do that if have been requested by other countries.
Okay, thank you. A question from Jeffrey Kuo, who's a PhD candidate in economics here, and this is to James and Jacques. The question is, 2 years ago, the referendum of changing the Taiwanese sports team's name did not get approved by the majority. If they run it again after the COVID crisis, would you expect any change in this result? And how do you see Taiwanese identity increasing even more after this? James, you want to start off with that, please?
Sure. So I do think that there is something a little bit different about this crisis. You know, there are always continually in U.S. news, in Taiwanese news reports, instances of how Taiwanese identity is being repressed on an international stage. And I think that kind of one of the themes that has emerged in this discussion is that this public health situation is actually qualitatively different because it risks lives in Taiwan and the rest of the world. And so I think that this does help push you know, a certain kind of mainstream thought even further into the mainstream, which is that there needs to be more of an emphasis on Taiwan as just Taiwan and not Taiwan as part of this older idea of the Republic of China, which remains kind of there in international law. And so I can't say for sure exactly what the public opinion will take after this crisis, but if it does go in that direction, then it would certainly not surprise me.
Anyone else want to join in? Dr. Lai, perhaps? Okay. Dr. Lai, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Sorry.
No, just
I
a
had to
question
unmute
about
myself.
identity.
Yes, the 2 years ago, the referendum that wasn't passed. One of the reasons was that people are afraid that once a passage, that will affect Taiwan's status in the international Olympic competitions. And so this is one of the major reasons why some people, they choose to stick with the status quo rather than the name changing. But I have to say that the COVID-19, already there are several episodes, like people found out that when they receive, when the host country received the donations, some of the symbols actually has something to do with China, and although it's a Republic of China, and that makes all the kind of confusions with the PRC, and also the our baseball league, which basically called the Chinese Professional Baseball League, that also makes our foreign friends very all kind of confusion about does that stand for Taiwan or for China. So yes, there are the increasing, probably that is a majority view in Taiwan, that they believe a certain change in terms of the international representation, so that can better reflect what the reality in Taiwan is. That certainly right now is the majority view in Taiwan.
Okay, thank you. A question that, a second question by Tina Chung, and since we have a little time, I'm going to take that from reporter for Voice of America. And this is for everyone. As President Tsai heads into her second term, what will likely be the theme for her speech on her administration's position toward China on May 20th? So a very specific question. What do you think she's going to say about China in her speech? Anyone? She's directed it, actually, she says Bob Sutter and all panelists. So
Get it started, but I think we're all guessing on this sort of thing. Taiwan strikes me as a very sober individual who is very concerned about Taiwan's sovereignty. And she's very experienced in cross-strait relations. She knows where all the buttons are that you don't want to push with Beijing. And so she'll avoid them and say something meaningful to the people in Taiwan that will deepen their sense of being in a good place with a good government. So I have a lot of confidence in her in finding that kind of those kinds of words. I think Beijing will be unhappy. Beijing is unhappy. They don't want her to be president because she's a formidable opponent, and because she knows these issues very well, and so and she's not going to do what Beijing demands that she do. So I think all of these things, I think, will find their way into her speech. But I think what she'll say, and will there be a big surprise? I don't think there'll be a big surprise. I think she's been fairly consistent, it seems to me.
sorry, I had muted myself. Anyone else want to take a guess on this? All right, hearing.
I was hoping Yi Zhong
Well, no,
got it.
well, that's in Taiwan that yeah, Taiwan has her own team, and I would not basically here. The issue is that we receive a lot of signal from China demanding President Tsai need to say this and say that in order to show that her goodwill toward China. But I have to say that the look at the Chinese recent military harassment against Taiwan has been ramped up. So I really hope that China could reduce the temperature a little bit, so that Taiwan will have a better reasons to really respond in kind.
Okay, thank you.
I would expect an inaugural that in some ways resembles her first inaugural. That is essentially saying, I'm not challenging the cross-strait status quo. If anyone's challenging, it's Beijing that's threatening to upset it. She's not going to say 92 consensus or one China principle, of course, but she will, I think, reiterate her respect for the way things are and how they got to where they are. And I would expect her to hard on the themes of how successful Taiwan's democratic liberal society has been in coping with COVID. And, I think she has to walk a fine line on how much to reference the Hong Kong situation, which is obviously key to her re-election, but is particularly neuralgic to Beijing and probably isn't necessary. But I think there'll be oblique references to how appealing the Taiwan model is and how Taiwanese people value that. Hint, hint, we don't want to be Hong Kong. So I think you'll see a lot of that, and I think you'll see the kinds of references to sovereignty that put down markers but don't cross red lines. So I would expect more of the same from the first inaugural, again with perhaps some stressing of the recent accomplishments. And that's focusing only on cross-strait relevance things, things on economic policy, social policy, things like that too, of course.
Maybe the handling of the pandemic, perhaps. All right. Thank you. Another question is from Eve Chu, a visiting scholar here, and she wants to know whether or not the upcoming presidential, speaking of elections, upcoming presidential elections in the US is going to have, what do you think is going to be the impact of that on US-Taiwan relations? I guess, again, it's...
I'd love to say something about this one,
yeah.
if you don't mind. This is, as a specialist who tries to keep track of what's going on in U.S. politics, you have this very firm policy on China from the Trump government, and they're reelected. I assume that they will continue that approach, and below the level of President Trump, it's a strong commitment to moving forward with Taiwan. Mr. Trump himself is avowedly unpredictable, and I'm not sure he cares about Taiwan. But I think below him, I think it's a strong imperative. On the Democratic side, this is a tough issue, it seems to me, because if you have people that work for Hillary Clinton, I work for Hillary Clinton, but if you have people that work for Hillary Clinton, they had a view toward Taiwan, which was what Obama did toward Taiwan. And that was a very strict construction of the one China policy. And so this, and so I wonder what's going, so for example, Jake Sullivan, who was working for Hillary Clinton, he was asked, would there be a change in your policy toward Taiwan? This was 4 years ago in the campaign. And he said, no, there won't be any change in toward Taiwan. And so even though Hillary Clinton was tougher on China in a lot of ways, people like that are in the higher levels of the Democratic Party. They have influence. If they still feel that way, they may do this. Obviously, the atmosphere in Washington has changed radically since that time. It's much more critical of China, and it's much more supportive of Taiwan. Nonetheless, there's still a very important group of specialists who feel you don't want to do this kind of thing with Taiwan because it's counterproductive in your relationship with Beijing. And so that way of thinking, that it's not worth the trouble. You don't want that trouble. On the Democratic side, I can see that reemerging to some degree. I'm not certain. It really depends on who gets picked and who's the Secretary of State and that type of thing, because it all has to be done in a way that would be very quiet in these days, because the atmosphere is such that Mr. Biden can't look like he's pro-China in any way. Otherwise, he'll be tarred with this Republican accusations. So it's a very interesting time to see that sentiment, which has been in the 45, 50 years of post-normalization America. It's that mindset that has been the dominant one. That's been the dominant one.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. We just have literally 30 seconds, but I do want Dr. Lai a chance to jump in on this one, on the question of US elections and what his thoughts are. Anticipation, apprehension. Dr. Lai?
Yeah, whoever being elected as a U.S. president this November, we believe that the U.S.-Taiwan relation is actually on a very solid ground. The bipartisan support across the aisle in the Congress, and also the recent executive branch, their initiative, and all laid a very solid foundation. So basically, we are not very worried about the who will be the president and how that's the Taiwan-U.S. relation will be worsening than before. And we just look for the new way for the furthering the cooperations, and hopefully that we could get something down the road, and especially in the post-COVID-19 era.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've basically come to the end. I want to take this opportunity to thank my panelists as well as the audience and for sending us the questions. And I have to say, there's nothing short of a miracle that we managed to get through our first international webinar without any technical glitch. At least I couldn't see anything. Maybe in the backstage there was some things going on, but I'm very optimistic now that we can do more of these things. Well, the topic, I think we haven't resolved it, obviously, and I didn't hear too much optimism about an invitation coming for Taiwan to join WHA, but I think in this time of great uncertainty, who knows? We might have some surprises, but I also want to ask that the audience to please complete the survey that you'll find at the East Asia National Resource Center on WebEx after you exit the event. But again, thank you so much. I know it's been, people had to get up early, stay up late, whatever, but we all really appreciate it and hope to see you back for other events at the Sigur Center and the National Resource Center. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.